Hello everyone, welcome back to Believers IS Academy. In today's topic of the day discussion, we will be understanding about the present dynamics with respect to the India's imports or the purchasing of oil from Russia, especially after when Donald Trump, the president of US, claimed that India has right now completely stopped buying from Russia, especially after the dialogue between India and USA, right? So this particular video is to try and understand if India can fully stop its buying from Russia with respect to the crude oil that India is right now depending on Russia as a major importing nation for meeting India's crude oil necessities, right? So we will understand in brief as to what is the present situation of India, or even for that matter, can India completely stop its reliance on Russia for its oil? And let's also try and understand whether this particular dynamic, as to how important this would be in shaping the further geopolitics, right? So let's start the beginning of, let's start the session, let's start the video. And even before we started, let's also understand what Mr. Donald Trump claims that his role that he had played in terms of getting to this particular understanding between India and USA, that he feels that whatever he said, or because of him, that India right now stopped buying oil from Russia. He specifically states, I was not happy that India was buying oil, and the Prime Minister Modi assured me today that they will not be buying oil from Russia ever again. That's a big step. Now we are going to get China to do the same thing. Of course, not so unusual for Mr. Donald Trump, but still, on the other hand, is this really feasible? Is this really possible on the India's part is what we'll have to check. So, however, Donald Trump has claimed, but the Ministry of External Affairs has clearly said that no such conversation has taken place between both the countries, right? And especially with respect to the importing of the Russian oil, the Ministry of External Affairs (MEA) clearly stated that there is no hard and fast, let's say there is nothing proof, there is no proof where we can assure that this conversation has ever happened. However, India is planning to continue to diversify its markets in terms of from where it has to get the oil supplies. Of course, not essentially depending on Russia. It is planning to diversify, correct? But also on the other hand, this disagreements has impacted India-U.S. trade talks and drawn international attention, is what the MEA has clearly stated, that although we are not fully depending on Russia, and also also we have not fully declared that we will completely stop the oil imports from Russia, but still we are trying to diversify our market. We are trying to diversify our market because this disagreement between the India and US, because the US doesn't want India to fully rely on Russia for the oils, correct? In fact, US wants India to look for an alternative other than Russia, probably some of the allies, or let's say subsidiaries of USA, right? So that is what Trump wants. And this disagreement, we have seen what has happened over the last 3-4 months, right? India has seen a lot of tariffs coming from USA because of this disagreement, right? It has impacted India-US trade talks and also has drawn international attention, right? So now if we have to try and understand the background as to what happened, as we all know, Russia still remains India's largest oil supplier. Like for example, if we take the data of the import sources of the crude oil in the year 2024, India has imported roughly about 36% of its crude oil essentials from Russia, followed by Iraq, which is 21%, and then we have the rest of the world 18, and most of the 13% is coming from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other US and other nations, right? And this is with respect to the crude oil. So here we can see that India is not fully dependent on Russia, although the majority share or the major part of the crude oil imports that India wants or that India utilizes is right now coming from Russia. And you can also see that it is a complete different figure as to how it was probably in 2022 or even 2023, because back in 2022 and 2023 we can see that the major share of India's oil imports were from Iraq, other than Russia. Russia wasn't that much in contributing for the India's oil imports. Now, why did India move to Russia? Correct. And what about Iraq? The answer is simple, that India had a let's say India had a better alternative, better option with Russia, considering the cost, right? It was more way friendly than, or let's say cost effective than the crude that was that India was importing from Iraq. And most importantly, the crude that the Indian government is importing from Russia, it is classified as medium grade. Medium sour grade. These are different grades of crude oil which gets utilized in refineries. So considering the refinery that India has, the grade that we are importing right now from Russia is most feasible and most convenient to process it for further utilizations of the country. So hence, also considering the cost effectiveness of the Russian oil, obviously India opted for Russia, correct? So right now Russia is the top contributor. So this is the only background, and of course we know what is the relationship between USA and Russia, especially after the especially after the Russia and the Ukraine war, right? So USA pretty much wants Russia to, absolutely calm down, completely take away all its troops from the Ukraine, and it pretty much wants to stop the war. And in fact, Donald Trump wants to feel responsible for the closure of the war, and hence all this geopolitical drama that we have seen over the period of time. Anyway, coming back to the drawback, or let's say coming back to the background, the major reason why US wants India not to go for the Russian oil is because one is India, Russia and US, obviously they are not doing good in terms of whatever we have seen in terms of Russia and Ukraine war very recently. And however, we have to also understand that India has been, or let's say the largest oil supplier for India ever since last 2 years, it's Russia, right? And on the other hand, US has imposed penalty tariffs on Indian oil imports from Russia. That is also we have seen. And also accordingly, especially after the Trump's reciprocal tariffs rolled out, even between June 2025, especially June and September 2025, we have seen that Indian public sector oil companies drastically has reduced Russian oil imports by almost 45%. So, right, so even Indian government also has tried its best, but doesn't mean that India is completely stopping, right? Because this move was also criticized by the China, saying that the US is trying to unilaterally bully all those countries which are in direct trade with Russia. If especially the enemies of US are supposed to be treated as enemies of the world, right? This ideology of the US was also condemned by China, stating that US is trying to unilaterally bully over India, bully India over Russian energy trade. And also, it is very important to understand what was the India's stance. India's stance with respect to energy security was very simple, that ultimately for India, what matters is energy security, that the crude oil imports, the oil imports should not reduce, and also it even requires stable prices as well, right? Stable, cost-effective prices as well. So these are the top priorities of India, and in fact, India doesn't want to get into any of the political pressure, because energy security is guaranteed, and even India is getting the crude oil imports for a very stable and a very promising prices, right? So this is what the background is, and this is what the underlying fundamental to understand whether India will completely cut off its supply, or let's say its import supply from Russia or not. So ultimately the main question, can India really stop Russian oil imports? Well, the answer is yes, but it is not completely, but it is partially. Well, considering the very cheap oil that India is expecting from Russia, and also considering the grade, the medium sour grade of the oil that India is getting from Russia, is something more conducive for the Indian refineries, which obviously India would not let it go out of the hand unless it finds another alternative, right? So what is India's first priority? Of course, India might, or let's say India can stop Russian oil, but not drastically, but partially, provided India's energy needs are met. Because high dependence, we have a very high dependence on crude oil, and right now we are importing most of it from Russia as a major supplier, and that oil which we are getting is also cost effective. So hence India right now, steadily it cannot just cut down Russia's oil supply, just like how Trump claims that India has pretty much stopped their Russian imports. So that is one of the important thing for India. India doesn't want to get into any of the political pressures, but it wants to make sure its energy security is met, and also it is cost effective, and also the prices are stable. Correct? And also India on the similar front also is looking for alternative sources, right? Because even doesn't mean that it is not under any political pressure, doesn't mean it can completely ignore US's tariffs, right? Because that is also drastically affecting the India's economic systems, right? So hence India is also looking for alternative sources to pretty much reduce the dependence on Russia as well. So hence it is looking for other Middle Eastern countries, even US for that matter, Africa, and other ways where India can also think of domestically producing the crude oil requirement, talking of which the ethanol blending, which is pretty much in use. So this is part and parcel of indigenously producing the domestic, or let's say indigenously producing the crude oil requirements of the country. So ethanol blending is pretty much in use. It is pretty much related to that. So India is trying to ensure its steady supply by making sure that it can diversify its markets by going to Middle Eastern countries, USA's, Africa, and also focusing on the domestic production, correct? And also to ensure that it is cost effective as well, right? Provided then I think maybe India can pretty much stop the Russian imports majorly. And however, India should also focus, or India will definitely focus, that it is not abrupting the economic in a very drastic manner, because this rise and fall of the prices and the fuel especially, right, it can completely change how the geopolitics works, geopolitical economic scenario works, right? So it can pretty much hurt the industrial production, correct? And it can even strain the energy security of any given country. And the very simple is the mismatch in the demand and supply of the fuel, which pretty much affects the stable price ranges of the fuel, which will completely take the entire global economics for a somersault, or let's say complete it'll completely overturn, right? So that is also one of the important thing which obviously we cannot ignore, correct? So doesn't mean that India stops its imports from Russia, that it is all possible. So this is one of the major thing which even other global strong economies also would not encourage. And then also talking about the current strategy, what is India planning to do? India is planning on a very broad base. It is trying to diversify its markets, and it is also trying to gradually reduce the Russian imports without compromising on the domestic stability, right? So this is what the very strategic or the wise decision that India is probably going to take in the future. In fact, this is what India is going to do, no doubt, correct? So this is all that you have to keep in mind, because Donald Trump tweeted on Twitter that saying that the Prime Minister of India has obeyed, or let's say listened to my words, and now it completely stops Russian oil. Doesn't mean that India is going to put a full stop to the Russian imports. Absolutely impossible, right? So now what is the way forward? First is gradual diversification, we discussed. Second is energy security, because energy security is also important. So hence the country should focus on prioritizing the stable supply through probably diversifying the markets, and also through domestic production of the fuel, the crude oil, and also look for more better affordable prices, options over external pressures. And third is getting into more diplomatic engagements, where we can have more diplomatic engagements with let's say Russia, even China, even Saudi Arabia, correct, and some of the subsidiaries of USA, to make sure that ultimately we are diversifying the market, and also we are not hurting the sentiments of US as well, because US is also one of our huge trading partners, right? So that is also very important. So it is important to maintain a strategic autonomy, right, with respect to India, while also managing the US, Russia, and China relations also, right? Because see, Russia is also very important. We have been depending on Russian imports for over 2 to 3 years, by till now. And now all of a sudden, because USA wants us not to trade with Russia, doesn't mean that India will straight away cut off, right? Because we have other relations with Russia as well, apart from the crude oil. So that is also very important. So hence, a very managing, or let's say a very balanced strategic approach is what India should take going forward. And also in the end, India should try and increase its domestic capacity of building or manufacturing or producing the oils, crude oils, and for which we also need more indigenously made, or let's say inbuilt refineries that we have, more renewables, and even strategic reserves to reduce the reliance on any single supplier like Russia, or even for that matter US, or even UAE, or even Saudi Arabia, right? So that is all for this particular video. So what is the key takeaway here? One is that India and US divergence highlights the challenge of the balancing strategic partnerships and national interests. It's very important to understand that how India would balance its stance to make sure that it is balancing the strategic partnerships between both the countries by not ignoring the national interests of the country. And second important thing, stopping Russian oil immediately is absolutely impractical for India, which obviously India also will not do. And hence, careful policy and diplomacy, in terms of how it manages both with Russia, even USA, and also how it utilizes other nations like UAE, any other, let's say, even for that matter, Kuwait, right? How it's going to use other countries also is the point of discussion here. Then third is India is asserting energy sovereignty while signaling openness to global trade norms, which is self-explanatory, right? So anyway, this is all that you had to know about what the Trump has recently claimed, that his words were more than sufficient for the India to just completely stop buying oil from that country on which India was completely depending on for the last 2.5 years, right? So anyway, that's all for this particular video. Signing off, this is Madan Gopal. Have a beautiful day.